tells us that God expects us now to be what we are. By the way, I always thought that was the best summary of the whole doctrine of sanctification. Be what you are. Not become what you are, but be what you are. Well, what are you? You're an adopted, dear child of God. You're a brother of Christ, a friend of the Son of God. Act like it. Be that.
What do you expect? Once there's no more sin, then it makes perfect sense that everything goes. Yeah. So, and we're going to be in for it. Tribulation, persecution, everything we stand for fails the test of respectability. And so I'll just keep certain things to myself. Well, it's true. You're not going to tell everybody everything. Yeah? We wouldn't have anybody in the ministry if you did. But with God, it's different. With God, to come out from behind the mask in order not just to humiliate yourself in his presence, but in order to grow in an appreciation of the greatness of his grace. That's always the purpose. That's always the goal. To get back to Jesus, to get back to his grace. But to the extent that you live behind the mask and start to believe that you are as good as you pretend to be, to that extent, grace will become cheap. And your preaching of it will become cheap too. So in the later part of the chapter, when we get further into it, Jesus is going to spend considerable effort violently ripping away the mask. We have spent some time doing that. Now, so that's the first basic meaning that we're most familiar with, that there are things inside that we don't let out on the outside, that we hide behind, and the danger is, the superficial danger is that we come to believe our own propaganda. I used to tell students that when I taught history. Great men in history, almost all of the great men in history who fell because they lost the distinction between reality and their own propaganda. We're talking about Alexander the Great, Napoleon, the mustachioed paper hanger from Austria. Make any difference? They all fell because they ended up falling for their own, believing that what they presented was the reality, when of course the reality was quite other. And so I used to tell students, pastors have to be especially careful of that. That they don't start to believe their own propaganda. That the image that they imagine their members have of them, that they recognize the difference between that and what's inside. Where they remain craven and desperate sinners. Who are in greater need of God's grace, if you want to put it that way, than those to whom they preach. Used to tell teachers that you have to remember when you're impatient with students and wonder how much longer you can be kind and gracious, you have to remember that you need God's grace much more than they do. They just haven't had enough time yet to pile up the sins that you had. And you can be a lot more patient with the people sitting in front of you if you recognize that your need is, and if you can put it that way, everybody's need, of course, is absolute. You can put it that way, that your need is greater than theirs. Because you spend all day with the Word of God and are still so far from perfect. Again, if you strip away the mask and come into the presence of God with some honesty. Remember preaching on Ephesians 5, one time, husbands, love your wives, wives, submit to your husbands. And in the wives, submit to your husbands part, he had this smile on his face from ear to ear. And then when it came to husbands, love your wives. Anyway, the point is, this woman did not have a capacity to commit the sins of David and Bathsheba. She had a capacity to make her husband's life miserable. You don't get a medal, that, as we used to call it, the true Christian martyr medal. You don't get the true Christian martyr medal for not committing sins you couldn't have committed anyway. I didn't kill 6 million Jews. I didn't have the chance. Not that I would have, but the point is, you don't get high marks for virtue for not committing sins that you were. There are certain sins that I simply can't imagine committing. You don't get a medal for that. You weren't tempted to them in the first place, so victory over them is no victory at all. But the sins of which I am capable, for which I do have a capacity, those I committed. So you can think of evil as, in a certain sense, relative to a person's ability to do it. To the extent that you have a capacity for evil and carry out that capacity, you are just as wicked as David and Bathsheba, who had a capacity for those sins and filled up the cup of their wickedness. Like I say, I'm glad you asked that, because I think it's a point worth making. When you deal with this list, I don't have a capacity for some of those sins. I mean, I can think of temptations I had in my life, and you probably can too, where the temptation might have been very strong, but where I said to myself, I could not live with myself if I did that. I have a hard enough time living with myself as it is. But if I stepped over this or that line, I don't know how there would be a cure for despair. Maybe you've had that situation in life more than once. But you don't get a medal for those sins that you couldn't commit anyway. Evil is measured by your capacity to do it. Upstairs, and the mother-in-law has a fever. I was wondering why she wasn't at the synagogue. She has a fever. She's homesick. But you come anyway. Typical, just like a man. Mother-in-law's sick, but you come over for supper anyway. Come over for the meal. She's sick. She's upstairs. She's burning up with a fever. Oh, okay. So go up. Oh, thank you so much. Let's see now. Where did I put the eggs? She gets on with the business of serving with what God. It's a touching story. And then this is especially touching. Then she told him everything. A woman telling everything. And this was when Jesus was in a hurry to... I didn't mean anything by that. I don't know. So let's say, but we all make mistakes. A man sitting behind me in church a couple weeks ago started talking about was it Goering or Himmler? I forget which. And I said, well, who's to judge? We all make mistakes. That's what. And he just. I said, anyway, he's a. Haven't seen him since. Well, anyway. When was the last time you talked about hell? We've talked about that, haven't we? Anyway,
we have.
That's not lately. Anyway, I mentioned that he did in Easter. Should I say that? In Easter sermon, he mentioned the possibility that some people go to hell. That's the first time I'd heard him say that in I don't know how many months. And I mentioned it to him, and so for the next few Sundays when he preached, he always had people going to hell, and he looked right at me when he said it. So wonderful being a member of St. Mark's. Well, lately he hasn't been looking at me, so he's not talking about hell anymore. Achtung, Achtung, die Stunde hat geschlagen. Wir sind bereit, wieder fortzufahren. Achtung! Yes, my pastor said it. You got to listen now. Do your liturgical dance. Maybe that'll get their attention.
I don't even remember what text was I preaching on.
Yeah, well, if you preach the text more, then you wouldn't have that problem. Yeah.
was preaching.
Yes, I know you were. I'm sure you were. So, I want to thank Pastor Werner and Pastor Jensen too for what he did. Pastor Werner got all these things together. He's such a clever fellow.
Oh, yeah. When I have liturgical dance at St. Mark's.
I was going to say, we've got a whole 5 minutes. Should we ask Pastor Werner to demonstrate for us what liturgical dance would look like? That might succeed in removing the temptation.
No, I don't think so.
Thank you, Pastor Werner.
Thank you. We'd like to thank Professor Deutschlander for what he's done.
In sanctification, we strive to become what we are. Yeah. And the Lord's Prayer summarizes that so well already in that first petition. Thy kingdom come. When does his kingdom come? When I confess and he forgives. And then when I share what he forgives with the rest of the people who need to confess. Thy will be done. What a hard one that is to pray. Yeah. Dein will geschehe, Herr, allzugleich auf Erden wie im Himmelreich. Ja. Ich verlasse mich auf. Thy will be done. We abandon ourselves to his will as it's expressed in his word. And when I can't figure it out, then I just say, whatever he does, he knows what he's doing. You know, that's, I think, an important principle when we pray that prayer to remember in counseling. We are so kurzsichtig. We are so short-sighted. People want an answer. People want a solution. They want it right now. Sometimes the solution is the grace to endure. Yeah. One of the ways I like to put that is we tend to think of the crisis of the moment as the last chapter in the book. It's not. It's somewhere in the middle. And we have to wait to see how God brings the book to a close for his glory and our benefit, because that's always his intention. If we think that the crisis of the moment just is nothing for me and for it but despair, then we don't take God's long view of things. That's another thing, by the way, in reading Bible history as well as reading the Gospels. Somebody ought to write a book on that. I've thought that for so long. Somebody ought to write a book on how the Bible uses time with reference to God. You know, you get the simple examples of the prophetic perfects in the prophets, where something is put in the past tense because God sees it as so sure that it will be done. It can't come out any other way. So you might as well put it in the past tense. But there are a lot of times in the Gospels and in history where God looks at things from a long-term view. We tend to look at things from the moment, where God looks at things from the end of them, and not just from the beginning or the middle. The beginning and the middle serve as pathway steps to the end, but they're not the end.